The air in Chairman Kang Dae-hyun's penthouse office was a suffocating blend of vintage leather, expensive whiskey, and unspoken violence. It clung to the back of the throat, a taste of power so absolute it was almost a physical presence. Outside, the glittering spires of the city clawed at a bruised twilight sky, but inside, the only light that mattered was the cold, calculating glare reflecting in three men's eyes. Lena felt it from her corner, a ghost in a light blue cleaner's dress, her presence as significant as a dust mote dancing in a sunbeam. She pushed her mop across the gleaming black marble, the rhythmic, wet slap a counterpoint to the tense staccato of the conversation. On one side of the vast obsidian desk sat Valerio Bellini, his Italian suit a masterpiece of effortless menace, his silver hair catching the light like a drawn blade. On the other sat Chairman Kang, a monolith of stillness, his face an unreadable mask of granite. Between them, a bridge and a chasm, was Eugene, Kang's wife. She was exquisite, a porcelain doll in silk, her voice a soft melody as she translated Valerio's guttural Italian into respectful, fluid Korean for her husband. Lena didn't need to see their faces to understand the stakes. They were in the blood of the spilled wine on the carpet she'd cleaned an hour ago, in the way Kang's knuckles were white where he gripped his pen, in the predatory stillness of Valerio's posture. She knew just enough Italian, learned from the angry, passionate arguments of the restaurant owners she'd worked for in her teens, and just enough Korean, picked up from the grandmothers in her neighborhood who paid her to run their errands. It was a patchwork of languages, scraps of other people's lives. But it was enough. She heard Valerio say, his voice a low growl, "The entire southern shipping channel, including the port authority clearance, will be under our joint control. 50-50 split, but my people manage the logistics. Your product is guaranteed passage." Untouched, Lena watched Eugene turn to her husband, her expression one of serene deference. But the words that left her lips were poison wrapped in honey. In Korean, she said, "He agrees to your terms, my husband. You will retain full control of the port, and they will simply pay for priority passage." A most generous offer. Lena's mop stilled. The water in her bucket seemed to turn to ice. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a nuance lost in translation. It was a complete reversal. A betrayal so blatant, so audacious, it stole the air from her lungs. Eugene was giving away the keys to Kang's kingdom, and he was nodding, accepting the poisoned fruit from her hand. The pen in Kang's hand was poised over the contract, its gold nib gleaming like a fong. In that moment, Lena was no longer a cleaner. She was the only person in a room of killers who knew the truth. Every instinct screamed at her to stay invisible, to finish her work and disappear. But the image of the old Korean grandmother who taught her the word for loyalty flashed in her mind. Some things, she had said, were heavier than stone. Lena dropped her mop. The clatter was a gunshot in the silent room. 3 pairs of eyes snapped to her. She didn't flinch. She walked, her cheap rubber-soled shoes silent on the marble, directly towards the obsidian desk, towards the most dangerous man she had ever seen. She leaned in close, her world shrinking to the space between her lips and his ear, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She whispered 5 words in English, the only neutral language in the room. "Your wife is translating wrong." The silence that followed Lena's whisper was not empty. It was a dense, heavy thing, filled with the sudden weight of consequence. Chairman Kang did not move a muscle. Not a twitch of his jaw, not a flicker of his eyelid. To Valerio and Eugene, he simply looked like a man pausing before the final, momentous act of signing his name. But Lena, still close enough to feel the dangerous heat radiating from his body, saw it. A change in the deep, dark pools of his eyes. The placid surface had frozen over, becoming a sheet of black ice, and beneath it, something cold and lethal was stirring. Eugene's smile tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. "Is there a problem, my husband?" she asked in Korean, her voice still a silken caress, but now it sounded to Lena like a snake rustling through dry leaves. Kang slowly lifted the pen from the paper, the motion so deliberate it was a threat in itself. He placed it perfectly parallel to the contract's edge. He turned his head, Not to Lena, but to Valerio. He offered a tight, controlled smile. "A moment," he said in heavily accented English. "My mind needs clarity." A final thought, Valerio, a predator sensing a tremor in the ground, gave a curt, suspicious nod. He had been so close to victory. This delay was an irritation, a loose thread he wanted to snip. Kong pressed a nearly invisible button on the underside of his desk. A moment later, his head of security, a grim-faced man named Mr. Choi, entered the room as silently as a shadow. "Escort Mr. Bellini to the lounge," Kong commanded in Korean. "Offer him my finest whiskey." The 30-year-old single malt. This was a gesture of respect, a gilded cage for the Italian's impatience. As Valerio and his men were let out, the office suddenly felt vast and cold. The only ones remaining were Kong, Eugene, Mr. Choi, and Lena, who had retreated to her bucket and mop, trying to merge with the background once more. The brief, almost imperceptible flashback hit Lena then. Her father, a military cryptographer, spreading out maps on their tiny kitchen table. He taught her that patterns were everything. "Listen to the rhythm, not just the words," he'd say, tapping out codes. "Betrayal has its own frequency." He'd been stationed in both Italy and South Korea. He'd filled their home with the sounds of foreign languages, treating them like puzzles, like music. For him, it was a job. For Lena, it was survival, a way to understand the complex, often dangerous world she was born into. That was why she knew. She wasn't just a cleaner. She was the daughter of a man who listened to lies for a living. And the frequency of Eugene's lies was screaming in her ears. Chairman Kong remained seated, his stillness a terrifying counterpoint to the frantic beating of Eugene's heart. He did not look at her. He did not look at Lena. His gaze was fixed on the contract, a document that was now a testament to a breathtaking act of treason. He picked up his pen again, not to sign, but to tap it rhythmically against the desk. Top, top, top. A slow, deliberate heartbeat counting down to an execution. "Eugene," he said, his voice deceptively calm, still speaking in their native Korean. "Remind me, what was Valerio's concern about the storm season in the South China Sea?" It was a test. A simple, elegant trap. There had been no mention of the storm season. Lena held her breath, watching the scene unfold. Eugene, ever the poised performer, did not hesitate. He expressed that his logistics team would need to account for potential delays during the monsoon months, "My husband." He proposed a small insurance clause, which I felt was reasonable. She was good. She was weaving a new lie from whole cloth, her voice smooth, her expression earnest. It was a plausible detail, a business-like fabrication. But it was a lie. Kang's tapping stopped. He slowly turned his head, his eyes finally locking onto his wife's. The warmth that had always been there for her, the deep affection he, in his own cold way, had held for her, was gone. In its place was a void. "That is interesting," he said, the words as sharp and cold as ice shards. Because what he actually said was, "My condolences on the loss of your cousin in Busan." A wave of confusion, then stark terror, washed over Eugene's face. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The lie she had prepared was useless against a truth she couldn't have anticipated. Kong had fabricated his own test, a piece of false information to see how she would translate it. He had said nothing about a cousin. He had said nothing about the storm season. He had been testing her response to a complete unknown, and she had failed spectacularly by trying to incorporate it into her deception. He then turned his gaze toward the door, where Valerio had exited. He had seen the slight, almost imperceptible tightening around the Italian's eyes when Eugene had translated. It was the look of a man hearing something he didn't say, a flicker of confusion quickly masked. At the time, Kong had dismissed it as a negotiation tactic. Now, illuminated by the cleaner's warning, it was a blazing confirmation. The pieces didn't just click into place, they slammed together with the force of a tectonic shift, shattering the very foundation of his world. The woman beside him, the woman who shared his bed, his name, his life, was not his partner. She was a viper he had welcomed into his home. The chill that washed over him had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the absolute zero of betrayal, a cold so profound it burned. He finally, slowly, turned his head to the corner of the room, his eyes finding Lena. She stood perfectly still, her hands gripping the handle of her mop like it was an anchor in a raging sea. He saw her now. Really saw her. Not as a fixture, not as part of the furniture, but as the single, unexpected variable that had just saved his empire. The illusion of civility shattered, leaving only the jagged edges of reality. Kong rose from his chair, his movement fluid and deliberate, like a panther uncoiling. The sheer menace in his posture made Eugene flinch, a stark contrast to her earlier composure. Mr. Choi, ever watchful, shifted his weight, his hand moving imperceptibly closer to the jacket of his suit. The room, once a stage for corporate theater, had become a cage. "The Italians can wait," Kong announced, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the marble floor. "They will enjoy my hospitality for as long as I require." He walked around the desk, his expensive shoes making no sound. He stopped directly in front of his wife, forcing her to crane her neck to look up at him. The power dynamic had been inverted with brutal finality. He was the mountain. She was the trembling stone at its base. "You will tell me," he said, switching back to Korean, each word a precisely chipped piece of ice. "Why you told me Valerio offered subservience when he demanded control." Eugene's mask of elegance was cracking under the immense pressure of his gaze. A tremor ran through her hand. I must have misunderstood the nuance, my husband. Italian is a complex language. Perhaps. Do not insult my intelligence." Kong cut her off, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more weight than a shout. "I have recordings of every meeting. Audio. Video. Every word that is spoken in this room is captured. Every translation. Every lie." He gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, where a pinprick of black in a ceiling tile was the only evidence of the sophisticated surveillance system that monitored his domain. This was a lie, a bluff designed to break her, but it was delivered with such chilling certainty that it had the immediate ring of truth. Panic flared in Eugene's eyes, wild and desperate. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. She had underestimated him. She had seen his affection as a weakness, his trust as a blindfold. She had forgotten that men like Kong do not rise to such heights on sentiment alone. They are built of suspicion and paranoia, layered over years of violence and betrayal. Lena watched from the periphery, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. This was no longer just about a bad business deal. She had lifted a rock and found a nest of snakes, and now they were all writhing in the sudden, harsh light. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the shadows, but she was anchored to the spot, a silent witness to the complete and terrifying unraveling of a life. Eugene's composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path through her perfect makeup, a glistening track of her downfall. "He promised me," she began, her voice cracking. "He promised me a life away from this." Kang's expression remained unchanged, his face an unreadable slate. "He promised you my money," he corrected her coldly. "And for that, you were willing to give him my throat." Kong circled Eugene slowly, his movements predatory. He was no longer looking at his wife. He was observing a hostile agent, an infection that needed to be purged. The air crackled with his cold fury. "What, exactly," he began, his voice dangerously soft, "were you promised in exchange for my entire southern distribution network? A villa in Sicily? A new name? Tell me the price of my life's work." Eugene was sobbing now, her carefully constructed facade dissolving into raw, pathetic fear. The porcelain doll was shattered. "It wasn't just the money," she stammered, the words tumbling out in a desperate flood. "It was a partnership. Valerio's faction, they saw my value. They saw my intelligence. They offered me a seat at their table. Not just as a wife. Not as an accessory." Her words were meant to wound him, a final, desperate jab at his pride, implying he had seen her as nothing more than a beautiful object. But they had no effect. Kang's world was not one of sentiment. It was one of assets and liabilities. Eugene had just reclassified herself. "So, You traded the Queen's chambers for a seat with jesters, he said, his voice laced with contempt. You would trade the empire I command for a foothold in a crumbling syndicate from the old country. A syndicate that still believes women should be seen and not heard. They were playing you, Eugene. Using your ambition as a key to my vault, he stopped in front of her, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the absolute absence of pity in his eyes. They would have given you a season of luxury, and then you would have disappeared. A loose end. Did you really think they would honor a deal with a traitor? Loyalty is the only currency in our world. And you, my dear, are bankrupt. He straightened up and turned to his head of security. Mr. Choi, the two words were a death sentence. They held all the finality of a judge's gavel. Mr. Choi stepped forward, his expression impassive. He knew his orders without them being spoken. This was the end of Eugene's story. As Mr. Choi took her arm, his grip firm and inescapable, Eugene's desperation ignited into a final, futile act of defiance. She twisted violently, her sharp nails raking at his face. It was the move of a cornered animal, all instinct and no thought. At the same time, she screamed a single word in Italian. Now. It was a signal. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, one of the junior security guards who had been standing impassively by the main door, a man Kong himself had promoted a month ago, drew his weapon. His name was Park. He was Eugene's man. The betrayal was deeper than Kong had imagined. It had spread within his own ranks. The betrayal was a serpent with more than one head. Park, the young guard, moved with shocking speed, his weapon aimed not at Mr. Choi, but directly at the center of Kang's chest. He was the fail-safe, the contingency plan. Mr. Choi, caught off guard by Eugene's desperate attack, was a half-second too slow to react. The cavernous office seemed to shrink, time stretching and compressing in the instant before the gunshot. A life, an empire, balanced on the edge of a trigger pull. But in that stretched second, another variable entered the equation. Lena. She had been frozen in place, a spectator to a drama far beyond her station. But the sight of the gun, the raw, immediate threat of death, broke her paralysis. Her past was not one of penthouses and power plays. It was one of dodging trouble in rough neighborhoods, of knowing when to run and when to fight. Her survival instincts, honed on the streets, were a razor wire buried deep inside her. Without a single conscious thought, she acted. She shoved her heavy-duty cleaning cart with all her might. The industrial plastic and steel frame, laden with water and cleaning supplies, became a battering ram. It shot across the slick marble floor, slamming into the back of Park's knees with a sickening crunch. The traitorous guard cried out, his legs buckling. His shot went wild, tearing a chunk of plaster from the wall far to Kang's left. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, a brutal crack that echoed the shattering of loyalty. The disruption gave Kong the opening he needed. He moved with a speed that belied his calm demeanor, closing the distance to Park in 2 long strides. He didn't bother with the gun. His right hand chopped down on Park's wrist, and a sharp snap echoed through the room as the bone broke. The weapon clattered to the floor. His left hand seized the front of Park's uniform, pulling him forward and down, while Kang's knee came up with brutal, crushing force. Park collapsed, unconscious before he hit the ground. Simultaneously, Mr. Choi, recovering from Eugene's attack, subdued her with cold efficiency, forcing her to her knees. The entire violent exchange had lasted less than 5 seconds. Silence descended once more, thick with the smell of cordite and adrenaline. Kong stood over the fallen guard, his chest rising and falling evenly. He hadn't even broken a sweat. He straightened his suit jacket, a gesture of absolute composure. Then he turned his head and looked directly at Lena. She was standing by her overturned cart, its contents spilled across the floor, her hands trembling slightly, her cleaner's uniform spattered with mop water. He wasn't looking at a servant. He wasn't looking at a ghost. He was looking at the unassuming girl who had just saved his life. For the first time that night, an emotion flickered across Chairman Kang's face, a glint of cold, hard appraisal, a flicker of respect. And this is the moment, Family, where the board is reset. It's where the pawn, the piece nobody ever watches, makes a move that saves the king. The world is full of invisible people, the ones who clean the floors and serve the drinks, the ones who hear everything and see everything because they're not supposed to matter. But sometimes they're the only ones who do. If you understand that power isn't always about who sits in the biggest chair, hit that like button and subscribe because the consequences of being seen are about to change Lena's life forever. The story resumed its relentless pace. The aftermath of the aborted coup was handled with a chilling, silent efficiency that spoke of long practice. Mr. Choi, his face grim, made a call on a discreet earpiece. Within a minute, 2 new guards entered the room. They were of a different breed than the others. Older, their faces scarred, their eyes empty of everything but loyalty. They were Kang's personal guard, the ones who handled the things that needed to disappear. Without a word, they hoisted the unconscious form of Park and dragged him from the room. His fate was sealed. Then, they returned for Eugene. She didn't struggle anymore. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a hollow, vacant despair. As they pulled her to her feet, her eyes met Lena's across the room. There was no hatred in her gaze, no anger. There was only a look of bleak, astonished recognition, the look of a master strategist who had been checkmated by a piece she never even knew was in play. They led her away, and the heavy office door closed behind her, the soft click of the lock a sound of absolute finality. Lena was left alone with Chairman Kong and Mr. Choi, the air still thick with the ghost of violence. She began to right her cart, her hands fumbling as she gathered her bottles and rags, instinctively trying to restore order, to retreat back into her role, into her invisibility. "Leave it," Kang's voice cut through the silence.
"It was not a request."
Lena froze, her hands hovering over a spilled bottle of glass cleaner. She slowly stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified he would see her as another loose end, another witness to be tidied away. Mr. Choi approached Kong, bowing his head slightly. "Sir, the Italians are growing restless," Kong nodded, his gaze still fixed on Lena.
"Let them," he said.
"Let them marinate in their uncertainty. It will make the new terms easier for them to swallow." He walked over to the wet patch on the floor, the mess from Lena's cart. He looked down at the puddle, then back at her. "You have a name?" he asked, his tone flat, impossible to read. "Lena," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Lena," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the name on his tongue. He saw the tremor in her hands, the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the steel that had been there in the moment of crisis. He saw a survivor. The mess was a stark reminder of the chaos that had erupted. Spilled water mingled with the dark red of the wine stain Lena had been trying to remove earlier, creating a grim tableau on the black marble. Chairman Kong stared at it for a long moment before turning his attention back to the business at hand. He gestured for Mr. Choi to retrieve the contract from the desk. He took it, and without a second glance, tore the thick, expensive paper in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor like dead leaves. The deal was off. The old world was gone. A new one was about to be forged in the fires of this betrayal. "Show Mr. Bellini back in," Kong commanded Mr. Choi. Alone, a few minutes later, Valerio Bellini entered the office, his professional patience worn thin. His eyes immediately took in the scene, the overturned cleaning cart, the faint smell of gunpowder, the absence of Eugene. His face, usually a mask of suave confidence, betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. He was a veteran of this life. He knew the signs when a situation had gone sideways. He looked at Kong, who now stood behind his desk once more, the picture of calm authority. "There seems to have been a disruption," Valerio stated, his voice wary. Kong gave a thin, cold smile. It did not reach his eyes. "A necessary reorganization," he replied in Korean, knowing full well Valerio wouldn't understand. He paused, letting the silence stretch, enjoying the Italian's discomfort. Then, he did something no one in Valerio's world, or even his own, would have ever expected. He spoke. In flawless, unaccented Italian. "Your plan was clever, Valerio. Using my wife's ambition against me. A classic, if somewhat predictable, strategy. The shock on Valerio's face was profound. His jaw literally dropped. The carefully constructed advantage he believed he held, the advantage of language, of secret communication, evaporated in an instant. He was exposed, vulnerable, stripped bare in the heart of his enemy's fortress. Kong continued, his Italian as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. You conspired with a traitor to seize control of my ports. You offered her trinkets in exchange for my kingdom. You severely, and I might say fatally, miscalculated. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You see, you assumed I was merely a businessman. I am not. I am an institution. And my first order of business is to correct market inefficiencies. Your organization, your rival faction, is one such inefficiency. Valerio was pale, sweating now. The hunter had become the prey. I don't know what you're talking about, he blustered, but the denial was weak, pathetic. Oh, I think you do, Kong said smoothly. So here is my counteroffer. It is not a negotiation. You will return to your masters, and you will tell them that the price for passage through my channels has just tripled. For them specifically. You will also provide me with the name of every man in your organization who knew of this plan. And as a gesture of goodwill, you will personally oversee the transfer of your faction's assets in the Macau casinos to my portfolio. Consider it a penalty for your poor judgment. Valerio Bellini stood frozen, a man staring into the abyss. Kang's terms were not a punishment. They were an annihilation. He was being ordered to dismantle his own faction from the inside out, to hand over its heart and soul. To refuse was to sign his own death warrant and likely ignite a war he could not win. To accept was a humiliation from which his reputation would never recover. He had walked into this room a kingmaker and was now being sent away a pariah, a tool for his own destruction. Kong watched him, his expression devoid of emotion. He had already moved on. Valerio was a loose end, a piece to be swept from the board. After a long, agonizing silence, Valerio gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The gesture was one of complete and utter defeat. I understand, he rasped in Italian, his voice hoarse. Good, Kong said, switching back to English as if the previous conversation had never happened. He gestured to the door. Mr. Choi will see you out. The Italian left without another word, his proud stride reduced to the shuffling gait of a broken man. The door clicked shut, leaving Kong, Mr. Choi, and Lena in the silent, cavernous room. The crisis was over. The threat had been neutralized and turned into an advantage. The empire was secure, stronger even than before. Kong walked over to the wet bar and poured himself a glass of whiskey, the same 30-year-old single malt he had offered his enemy. He took a slow sip, savoring the burn. He had faced down betrayal and stared into the barrel of a gun, and now he was rewarding himself as if he had merely concluded a difficult day of business. He turned his attention, finally and fully, to Lena. She was still standing by her cart, a small, unassuming figure in a simple blue dress who had become the fulcrum upon which his entire world had turned. She expected to be dismissed, perhaps with a wad of cash and a stern warning to forget everything she had seen. That was how this world worked. Witnesses were a liability. But Kong saw something more.
He saw the instincts that had made her act.
He saw the intelligence behind her eyes. He saw the quiet strength that allowed her to stand in a room full of monsters and not crumble. He walked towards her, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He stopped a few feet away, studying her as if she were a complex piece of art. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out not a wallet, but a single, unmarked black keycard. He held it out, placing it on the clean, dry part of her cart's handle. It lay there against the cheap plastic, a stark contrast of two worlds colliding. Lena stared at it, her brow furrowed in confusion. This is for you, Kong said, his voice a quiet, serious command. The executive residences. Floor 42. There is a new position available. Head of Internal Auditing. Your job will be to listen.
To watch.
To see the things that I do not. Your silence tonight was valuable. But your eyes, Lena. Your eyes are worth a great deal more. Lena stared at the black keycard. It was a simple, featureless piece of plastic, but it felt as heavy as a gold brick in the sudden, silent gravity of the room. Floor 42. The executive residences. It was a place she only knew from whispers among the cleaning staff, a mythical floor of luxury and power she was never meant to see. Head of Internal Auditing. The title was corporate, sterile, but she understood its true meaning immediately. He wasn't offering her a job, he was offering her a seat at the table. He was asking her to be his eyes and ears, to be the ghost she had always been, but this time with purpose, with power. This was a world she had never asked to be a part of. It was a world of violence, of lies, of brutal consequences. But it was also a world where she might never be invisible again. A world where she might finally matter. She looked from the keycard up to Chairman Kang's face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a strange, newfound clarity. He had seen her, truly seen her, and in this world, being seen by a man like Kang was both a blessing and a curse. It was a shield and a target. He had given her a choice, but it wasn't really a choice at all. To refuse was to walk out that door and spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, a loose end he might one day decide to tie up. To accept was to step into the cage, to trade her freedom for a gilded form of servitude, but one with influence she could never have dreamed of. She thought of her father and his puzzles, his belief that every pattern could be read, every code could be broken. Perhaps this was her code to break. She reached out, her hand no longer trembling, and her fingers closed around the keycard. She didn't say, "Thank you." Words were cheap in this room. The gesture was enough. It was an acceptance, an agreement, a contract signed not in ink, but in shared, dangerous knowledge. Kang gave a curt nod, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He had found a new asset, an unexpected weapon forged in the crucible of that night's betrayal. "Mr. Choi will arrange the details," he said, already turning away, his mind moving on to the next problem, the next move in the endless, intricate game. He walked towards the great window overlooking the city, a king surveying his domain, now more secure than ever. Lena stood alone in the center of the vast office, the black card cool against her palm. She looked down at her simple blue uniform, at her worn-out shoes, at the spilled water on the floor. It was the last time she would see herself this way. The cleaner was gone. Something new, something more dangerous, was just beginning. The reflection in the polished marble floor showed a young woman standing tall, no longer a ghost in a machine, but a new, vital component within it, her shadows stretching long and deep in the aftermath of the storm. So, what do you think of that, family? A story of betrayal, of hidden strengths, and of a world turned upside down. Do you think Lena made the right choice? Is taking Kang's offer a path to power, or just a different kind of prison? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. What would you have done in her position? And if you enjoyed this journey into the shadows, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have so many more stories to tell, and you don't want to miss a single one. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you in the next one.